Thank you, Chairman. In the same vein, my name's Hugh McCaughey. I'm Chief Executive of the South Eastern Trust. I'll maybe get my colleagues to introduce themselves and then I'll make our opening statement. Charlie?
My name is Charlie Martyn. I'm Medical Director of the Trust and a consultant in emergency medicine.
Good afternoon, Nicki, Patterson, Director of Nursing and Older People and Primary Care in the Trust.
Afternoon, Seamus, McGoran, Director of Hospital Services in the Trust.
Before we make the opening statement, can I make sure, can everybody hear us at the back? Yep, okay, we'll take those nods as... Hugh, the floor is yours if you'd like to.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. As you're very well aware, we have actually been sitting in the body of the audience for the last 2 or 3 hearings. And I suppose part of that was to make sure that when we came today, we actually provided the best information and contributed it as positively as possible to the hearing. I suppose that has probably influenced our opening statement. I think we've picked up a number of themes which you've been asking about, and I suppose the statement will pick up 3 of those, maybe just to get the discussion going and to give us an opportunity maybe to say at the outset, as opposed to just in answer of questions, our position on some of those things. The 3 areas I'll pick up are the issue of human rights framework or the right to health. The issue which has been asked a fair bit about is in terms of the governance of that, and then the issue of what we would term continual improvement, but which you've mentioned there as progressive realisation. We also will, and you mentioned Professor Hunt's some of the publications, and particularly, I suppose, the UN publication in 2008, which I think has been the basis of and referred to in your discussion document, and which I think we'll use as a touchstone for some of the points we want to make. So first, I suppose, the human rights framework and the right to health. And I suppose you've asked a number of people, and I think the answers have probably been equivocal in terms of should there be a written framework? Is there a framework in place? I think it could be quite unequivocal and say, I believe the human rights values. I think if you like, the contents of a human rights framework are already embedded in our systems, our practice, and our values. I've asked a number of occasions, do we talk about it? We talk about it explicitly. We train people in it, and we transfer or mainstream it into our systems, our practice, and our values. So if I maybe pick off each of those, just to give you an illustration of that, some evidence of that. Where do we talk about it? We talk about it at every level. So at board, we have it, it's explicit in our corporate plan. We bring reports to our trust board and senior team. We do screening of any service changes and policies at the corporate level. Just by way of illustration, only last month, we brought an annual report, Equality and Human Rights report, to the senior team. We had an explicit discussion about our objectives last year, progress, challenges, and indeed, I suppose, the objectives looking ahead over the next 12 months. At a directorate and team level, we have probably about 100 policies, on average about 100 policies a year we screen and we test against equality and human rights considerations. At the individual, and the evidence, I suppose we've given some evidence of that in the pack. Happy to explore further in that. At an individual level, I would argue that even in terms of our individual appraisal of staff, where we're raising issues around how they deliver care, is their communication good? Do they respect people's privacy and dignity? Then actually those are the basis of your human rights framework, and they're the basis of good quality of care, as we would say it. But also we have explicit discussions with individuals. I was talking to one of our equality officers who highlighted only in the last few days queries coming in around from individual members of staff around whether changes in practice or new services or the way we deliver services is meeting the human rights requirements. And particularly the one example she gave was around introducing new services into people's homes and whether that met all the articles of Human Rights Convention. So do we talk about it? Yes, I think we talk about it explicitly at every level. In terms of training, again, we've submitted in our pack, so I'll not go in and sort of rehash some of the examples of that. But at every level, from trust board down to individual, including at our induction, we include aspects of human rights training and do that quite explicitly. Then importantly, and I think a crux issue for me is around then the transferring, if you like, the third T, the transferring or mainstreaming into our practice. And I think, again, we do that at every level. And it's important that what we want it to be is not some obligation, but that it actually goes into the core of how we deliver services, into our systems, into our practice, into our values, and into how we actually test those things. So to give you some examples, again, at a regional level, and I don't think this was perhaps brought out a couple of days ago, but at a regional level, things like Quality 2020, which is I suppose the regional document in terms of how we will ensure safety and quality of care. There is an attributes framework being developed. There's leadership competencies for ward sisters, officers in charge, which make explicit some of these responsibilities. So I think at every level there is examples and evidence of that. So in Quality 2020, I think we have it at the regional level. At a trust level, as I've mentioned, we already have our corporate plan, we screen policies, etc. At a team level, it's embedded in practice. It's also embedded into our culture and into our values. And I think importantly, do people actually necessarily think human rights as they do it? Or do they think this is good quality care and this is how I interpret good quality care? And I think you've mentioned a number of times, and I think it may well be your most retweeted tweet, but was your comment about a good health worker is a good human rights worker. And I think the vast bulk of our staff think in terms of this is just good quality care. They don't think in terms of this is a human right. It's just embedded into the values and the culture. And I think that's the way it should be. If I can move on to the second area, which is around governance, and you have asked on a number of occasions about how do you make sure this happens, what is the governance system? I suppose for me, what is the definition of good governance? I think for me, quite simply, and at a very simple level, it is how we ensure we deliver our objectives, the things that we want to achieve. And for me, that's at the core of what is good governance. I have been, and I suppose as an organisation, we have been a critic over the last number of years, for a good few years, of the NHS's performance system. I think it is very much a top-down system. I think it is very much clock-based. So we actually have a small number of targets, and we've seen, and I think somebody mentioned yesterday the issue of, I think it might have been you, Professor Hunt, around the sort of terror of targets and the use of targets as the simple way of driving and judging success. And I think the NHS performance system, as it has developed, takes a small number of targets, and when you actually look at it, fails to embed quality of care right into the core of how we measure success. So how often do you see in terms of the performance system for the NHS that the top priority or good indicators of quality of care? And linked to that, as I was saying a minute ago, is the core issue of good human rights. So how have we, and I actually think that's how things like mid-staffs have happened, where you actually create an organisation and a system where you judge success, not by quality of care, but by a small number of targets, which are clock-based, and you can create a great disconnect between the top of the organisation, who becomes concerned with their success being judged in those ways, and the front line, who want to live those values of delivering good quality of care. And I think that's where it's at.
One more minute, Hugh, because I'm conscious of...
All right, well, if you could maybe give me a little bit of leeway, because I am answering some of your questions here.
Yes, yeah.
So what we have developed here over the last 4 years, or have been developing, is a new performance system, which we call SQE. What does that stand for? It stands for, and what we want is to create a system where we give control back to the front line. We give control back to teams to actually judge, well, what is quality of care? What does success look like? How would you want to be judged in terms of the quality of that service? And we want every team, the framework for us around that is every team should test themselves against 3 parameters. First parameter is safety. Is the service up to standard? Not based on a very simple clock-based target, but how do you test it against standards that are relevant to that service? So for instance, in emergency medicine, we use the College of Emergency Medicine standards to test whether we're delivering the service safely. We benchmark against those, we participate in national audits. The second area is Q, which is around what could we do better on? What can we improve? So that the mantra is assure safety, improve quality, and the third area then is the E, which is test the experience. And I don't mean just in terms of user satisfaction, but what is the user's experience of how we deliver care? Do we do it in the right way? Do we respect their dignity? Do we respect their privacy? Do we communicate well? All the things which are core to human rights and to quality of care. And we embed those things. How do we measure them? We use a range of things. But importantly, our EDs, our emergency departments, have SQE plans. They test themselves against quality indicators other than 4-hour and 12-hour. They measure standards which are central to human rights and are embedded into the way we judge success, and more importantly, that they're empowered to judge success. So we use some of the things, and I'm sure we'll explore them a bit further, like 10,000 voices. We have nursing key performance indicators, which again mainstream some of these things into how we judge success at a service level. And we also use the quality of care standards, which have been talked about. Importantly for us, that drives improvement. And you would have heard one of our, Sean and Ruth and Jill mention yesterday, on the back of 10,000 voices, we have set up the feedback we got from that. We've set up a pain relief management group, because one of the themes we got feedback on was, were there some issues? Could we have done better on pain relief management? When you look at the totality of responses we got, it was quite small, but it was one of the themes. And in the spirit of continual improvement or progressive realisation, that's one of the issues we've picked up. So we established some months ago a group to look at, was there something we could do better? And finally, I suppose the third area is progressive realisation. I'll skip quickly through it. For us, that is, there's a fundamental issue in the international patient safety movement. Do we get it right every time? And clearly the answer is no. No healthcare system, no hospital, no healthcare worker gets it right every time. So the issue for us is that we have to create a culture of continual improvement and learning, or in your terms, which you've used before, the progressive realisation of that standard of quality of care and aspiring to get closer to it. Is it working? At a regional level, and again, I don't think this was mentioned explicitly, was the safety collaboratives that we've been involved in as EDs, as emergency departments, where all the emergency departments collaborated and actually set a basket of quality indicators other than the 4-hour and 12-hour. And that work was coordinated and led by the Safety Forum. At a trust level, we participate in at ED, we participate in national audits and benchmarks where we can test our results and whether they're up to standard. And at the individual level, in terms of feedback, we've used the 10,000 voices I mentioned on pain management. But also I'd pick out one other example. We had a complaint about 3 or 4 years ago, and the board gave you evidence last week of around the SAI process. And one of the areas where they've made improvements was around feedback on palliative care patients. We had a complaint 3 to 4 years ago where we had a death in ED of a man who was terminally ill with cancer, and his wife fed back through her complaint her experience of that. On the back of that, we took the learning from that and have introduced a new policy. At that time, before the sort of board SAI process, and on the back of that, we introduced a new policy where end-of-life patients will either bypass or go through ED extremely quickly. So on the back, just as an individual feedback learning on how we change practice. Is it working for staff? Is it changing our culture? I suppose I would pick out 2 questions from the staff survey, which I think give you some sense of the movement. There was the 2 surveys done in 2009 and 2012, and we await the one next year, which we hope will see further improvement for us. Is the care of patients my organisation's top priority? was one of the questions. And in 2009 it was 54%, and it's risen to 67% 3 years later, during which time we had introduced SQE. That's well above the regional and well above the national average. The second question, senior managers, are your senior managers committed to the provision of a quality service? At a time in those 3 years when we saw the national figures reduce, our figures increased from 52% to 64%, a 12% increase, well above the national average and the regional average as well.
Hugh.
Okay, so
15 seconds to round up.
I'm sure you'll cover Downpatrick, which would have been the other thing I would have wanted to say. But I suppose in conclusion, I think we do embed this. We do believe the human rights framework, the core issues in relation to human rights are embedded into what we define as quality of care. We are building a governance system which enables us and puts quality of care at the centre of how we judge success rather than top-down targets. And use your term, we're progressively realising a better culture in terms of learning. And I think that's certainly the feedback we get from staff as well. Okay,
thank you. I'm going to kick off, and I'll maybe start with the human rights framework. I was very interested in terms of what you were saying. And I guess my interest is and you acknowledged and you've heard in the earlier hearings the issues of how you embed human rights principles into a framework of dignity and respect and participation, access to information, etc. And to date, I guess, the response has been one of, well, yes, we're implicitly doing all of that. It's not articulated in a human rights framework, but it's there. And I suppose, interestingly, you've put that much more to the forefront than some of the other witnesses we've had to date who have started from a position of, well, we didn't think of those in terms of a human rights framework until you mentioned it, but we are doing that. And the reason I ask that is that I had a look at some of the across the Trust's documents in the last few days, and certainly in terms of equality, and you talked about screening and all of those issues, the South East Trust is up there with other trusts. But I was struggling to find an explicit reference, so I'm heartened to hear all of that's happening. But I wonder if you could tell us how explicitly, if I was to look for the kind of documents or the staff, and I recognise that documents is the start point and not the end point of all this, where and how you have, if you like, translated this into what I'll call a human rights framework to ensure that staff understand that that's the framework within which they operate.
I suppose, I'll kick off and others will jump in.
Sure.
I think I mentioned we have on our corporate plan, it's explicitly mentioned, we take annual reports to our EMT, to our trust board, in terms of the things that we're trying to achieve, progress with those, the challenges and objectives again for the incoming year. I think also it's embedded in a range and considered across a range of other policies, and we test and screen against other policies to ensure that the human rights requirements are embedded into that. We do, and as I say, take DMT last month, and you can see how the different articles relate to what we're doing on the ground, relate to our policies. So I do believe it's explicit. I understand you have been, and it has been a common question in terms of whether that should be a written framework. I wouldn't have a problem with it being a written framework if that makes it more explicit. I suppose the issue I would have is that won't necessarily make a frontline healthcare worker do it more. I think it is when they own it as a part of their values. So when I went and talked to one of our ENPs a few weeks ago, emergency nurse practitioner in the ED, and she's a regular tweeter, and the things she would put a lot of the issues which you would identify as the core issues to define human rights, but she would see those as quality of care. She doesn't need to be told, and in fact I think would almost push away that you have to do this because it's a human right. No, I do it because it's good quality care. It's the values at the core of my professional values. It's the core of how I want to deliver quality care. And I think sometimes our staff would rail a little bit about it being an obligation, a human rights obligation, because they see it and want it to be a part of their values. If we want to be successful, it has to be embedded in how we judge success and has to be a part of the core values of the way we deliver services.
Perhaps to add to that, specifically in relation to nursing, Hugh has mentioned around values, and in relation to nursing and other professional groups, in their code of conduct, the absolute core of the importance of human rights, and certainly from a trust perspective and feeding back, the Nursing and Midwifery Council code of conduct is currently being reviewed on the back of many recent experiences, not least mid-staffs. And one of the elements we included within our feedback was the importance of these key fundamental values within nursing. And whilst the expansion of roles within nursing, and he's made mention of talking to an emergency nurse practitioner, and those roles are absolutely to be welcomed, the core values that are all about human rights, about dignity, about privacy, about ensuring that we engage with those that we're caring for, absolutely must remain fundamental to our profession. I've been nursing 30 years, and at the start of my nursing journey, the importance of holistically looking at the patient in front of me and engaging with them as a whole person, and that remains a fundamental value of nursing. And certainly, whilst exactly as you said, it may not be something that if you spoke to 100 frontline nurses, they would articulate the importance of human rights within a framework. Should be fundamental to what actually guides their practice.
And perhaps if I could add from a framework perspective, our corporate plan we develop every 3 years. We consult with our staff, with our public, with our key users and stakeholders. Our core themes within the corporate plan are around safety, quality and experience, as Hugh has already mentioned. They're very much about access to our services, to ensure that we have equity of access and equity of outcomes. To involve people at a personal and public level, so personal and public involvement is a major theme within our organisation, as is our staff. Their rights to have a balanced life and their rights to be empowered to deliver the very best care to our patients. So we mainstream human rights, values, principles, legislation into everything we do. And at an operational level, I'm the Director of Hospital Services. I have operational responsibility for how we deliver our services. And the way we do our business in the South Eastern Trust is I have my operational team, and I'm supported by individuals from our finance functions, our planning and performance functions, and our human resource and equality functions. They're in the room with us. They're helping us mainstream our practice. They're helping us understand the consequences of our decisions and making sure that we mitigate against some of the potential impact of those decisions on the people that we serve.
I would say, I suppose, not to leave medicine out, but I'll not detain you too long. I would say it is an absolute core value thing, which is at the heart of good medical practice, and good medical practice for the GMC has come quite a distance in the last 10 to 15 years in terms of reflection on practice and confidentiality, privacy, dignity, all of these sorts of things. So doctors, I think, would probably find it hard probably to have a framework imposed upon them. I think as a doctor, that said, they would abide by the framework word developed and imposed, or maybe imposed isn't quite the right word, but what I would say is it's at the centre of what they do. I think we should also probably look back to medical school and see about the type of people that we're bringing in to medicine, because we have people who come in and get high points in a whole variety of things, but there's more to medicine than just the academic ability to do the job, and so there is something within you, there's something empathic, and treating someone like it's your father, your mother, or your brother or whatever, and that's what I like to see my doctors are bringing to the piece, and I've no doubt most of the nurses or all the nurses would be the same, would feel it in that way.
Yeah. Okay, no, I'm encouraged. I think my observation is that the importance of putting it into a framework in human rights is that a great deal of emphasis on values and practice, and those are really important. I think the importance of putting it into a rights framework is it allows everyone, from staff to service users to clinicians, to recognise that these are actually rights as well as it's not just about good practice or even best practice, it's actually about human rights. So, and it allows you then to explore that not only should your service users be treated with respect and dignity, but, for example, so should staff, both in terms of how they're as employees, but also as the people in the front line of the service. And that allows you to engage service users as well, in that the human right includes staff to be treated properly, etc. So it moves you into slightly different terrain, and that would be my observation on that. I'm sure Paul will pick up kind of the some of the issues around accountability and the human rights framework a bit further. I'm very conscious we're in Downpatrick. I couldn't possibly let you leave the stand without clearly the following question. As you know, and better than me, from January of this year, you took the decision to close the emergency department at nights and at weekends in both Downpatrick and the Down Hospital and Lisbon at Lagan Valley. I really have two questions to ask you. First of all, just tell us why that decision was taken. And then secondly, what impact do you think it's actually had to date in terms of quality of care, etc.?
Okay, I'll maybe get Seamus to answer in a bit more detail, but I suppose just by way of introduction, I would say two things, because your focus is clearly on emergency departments. But I suppose the changes we have been making over the last number of years are guided by two things. One is, and very relevant to January, is sustainability, that the service has a stability and a sustainability into the future. Clearly the issue around January and the ED is well documented in terms of the shortage, a national shortage of middle grade doctors. And for us then looking to find the best model in the short term to sustain the service, and that's where we've come up with our urgent care model. But the second important issue, I think, for us is also in terms of changes that have been happening to the hospitals, is ensuring that our services comply, back to the SQE, comply with standards, and we can deliver them safely. And it's a fundamental principle for us that we will not deliver a service which is not safe and up to standard. I believe that for us to do that would be a breach of people's human rights if we were knowingly delivering a service which can't comply with standards. So again, that has led to us making changes over the last number of years. What we've tried to do is make those changes in an evolutionary basis. We plan them ahead. We try not to have them reacting to last minute changes or crisis. I do think that the future of our smaller hospitals is evolving and changing. The role is not to be sort of mini acute hospitals and trying to replicate everything that the other hospitals would do, but trying to do the things that they can do well and deliver services for the local population. Also, one of the things gets frequently lost is that by networking those hospitals in with Lagan Valley and the Down in with the Ulster, it has enabled us to bring new and additional services that we previously weren't able to provide. So there are new things that we're providing now that weren't historically available. So I say that by way of context. There are two key drivers for us, sustainability and safety, and that has guided a lot of the changes that we make. But I'll ask Seamus to comment on the particular changes around January, and Charlie may want to back him up.
I will have to go back to the very first changes we made to the emergency department in 2011 to give you some of the context that we've been dealing with for a number of years. At that time, there was already a national shortage of emergency department doctors. The Down Hospital had lost its training recognition for junior doctors about 2002, actually, so a long time before we were making the changes, was totally reliant on middle grade doctors. And at that time, we had 6 middle grades. And we really needed 11 middle grade doctors to run a 24/7 rota. It was very obvious that with the national shortage, that despite our best efforts, including an extensive recruitment campaign using over 30 recruitment agencies, having specialist partners recruiting across the world for us with very little success, and those doctors we did manage to attract, we could only retain them for a very short while, actually. And I think a reliance on a recruitment strategy that overly relies on overseas recruitment has not been successful. So despite our best efforts, it was obvious to us in 2010 that the emergency department on a 24/7 basis was no longer sustainable. It was no longer safe, and I have no doubt that we would have been compromising the human rights of the patients that we serve if we had allowed that to continue into a situation where ultimately it would have collapsed. So we took a proactive decision to examine alternative models to urgent care for the people of Downpatrick. We worked very closely with our clinicians, our GP colleagues in the community who have done an outstanding job working with us to actually change the model of care. We looked at the types of patients who were using our services, and particularly those patients who were using our services at night time. And actually we find quite a lot of those patients were entirely appropriate to be managed by general practitioners and really didn't need an emergency department service. Clearly there were some patients who did. So after going through the options, considering the potential impact of those options, equality screening all of those options, going through a very comprehensive consultation and engagement exercise with the wider public, and then finally coming to a decision, working very closely with our local Downpatrick GPs, who were very instrumental in actually shaping our thinking through the consultation exercise, and our original plans changed by the time we'd finished the consultation exercise. So we went through that process, put an implementation plan in place with the expectation that we would still be able to retain 97% of the attendances who would use the new urgent care model, which would be an emergency department from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and a GP out of hours service, which picked up the remaining hours from 8 p.m. until 8 a.m. the next morning. We launched the new service on the 1st of April, and it is a shining example of new, innovative ways of delivering urgent care services to a local population in the context of a shortage of emergency department doctors. We're very proud of that new service in Downpatrick, and when we had the time to deliver that change, I think we were hugely successful. And 97% retention of people attending the department. In the end, it probably meant about one patient per night having to go in ambulance to the Ulster Hospital. I do not underestimate the inconvenience for any individual patient in that situation, but we have a very quick, and I hate to use the term, but it means something in hospital land, repatriation policy, which means that if a patient is having to go up to the big acute hospital, we get them back to the local hospital as quickly as we possibly can, but in a safe and timely fashion. So the consideration of all of our patients was absolutely paramount in making sure that we were still able to deliver the very best access to local services for the local population, and then where their needs were more acute, that we'd make sure that we could deliver that. And I think there's probably a lack of understanding about what the smaller hospitals have. There is no critical care unit in the Down Hospital. We cannot perform emergency surgery. We cannot actually deliver any overnight surgery at all. We do not have obstetric services, paediatric services. There is no on-site laboratory or blood bank. So the type of patient that we're able to manage well, and I have to say extremely well, our staff do a fantastic job, are patients, generally older patients with chronic conditions, or maybe patients who have more minor issues or illnesses. So that service has been transformed. It has been absolutely fantastic. But unfortunately, the number of middle grades we have today, compared even to 2011, is 4, not 6. We have struggled to attract any other emergency department doctors, and as she has already alluded, there is a national shortage of ED middle grade staff. Leading up to Christmas last year, it was evident that this situation was not unique to Downpatrick, not unique to the South Eastern Trust, Northern Ireland, or even the UK. There were a number of emergency departments that had experienced changes from 2011 to Christmas 2013. We had to make changes in Lagan Valley. The emergency department at the Belfast City Hospital closed completely due to staffing issues and other supervision issues. So we found ourselves competing for a reducing pool of middle grade doctors, and each emergency department across the region was having to recruit more and more locums and permanent staff. Everyone fishing in the same pond and fewer doctors available. By 2 weeks before Christmas, it was evident that we could not even cover all the shifts across the Christmas and New Year. 15 shifts unfilled, absolutely no stone left unturned. 70 shifts in January, not filled. If you think about having 4 middle grades in the Down and 2 middle grades in Lagan Valley, we were 50% reliant on locums at weekends and 75% reliant in Lagan Valley on locums at weekends. That is not a way to deliver safe, sustainable services that respects, fulfills and protects human rights. So we were very clear that unfortunately we had to make a quick decision in the interests of safety of our patients. We made our best endeavours to engage as widely as we possibly could, but it was evident that we could not retain those departments on a 7-day basis beyond the first week in January. Now, that was a very difficult period for the local people in Downpatrick and Lisburn. It was a very difficult period for all concerned. We did work with our colleagues in other hospitals to ensure there was increased capacity, and I think our colleagues in Belfast and Craigavon, they all did a fantastic job enhancing their staffing in ED and their bed capacity to deal with any impact. In terms...
Can I stop you, Seamus, because I'm conscious of time. The second part of the question was impacts, and I wondered, and given what colleagues had said earlier, how have you measured, what feedback mechanisms and how have you measured the impact of that decision in terms of both the services you continue to provide in the Down Hospital, but also in the alternative arrangements you've made? Well,
across a range of indicators, and from, just to very briefly finish off, we introduced a nurse-led minor injury service at the beginning of March in the Down Hospital at weekends. So effectively, in terms of the number of people using the service, on average we would have had about 100 people using that service across the weekend in the emergency department when it was open. 48 people on average use the nurse-led minor injuries unit service every weekend. An additional 20 patients are attending the GP out of hours service. And don't forget, we have an integrated ED, GP out of hours and nurse-led minor injury service. So the front door of the Down Hospital is open on a 24/7 basis. There can be a little bit of variety in terms of the types of patients they can deal with at any given time. But actually, we've retained 80% of the attendances. So in measuring quantitative terms, we're very clear that actually we've quickly made up ground in the number of patients who could not access their local service. We also introduced direct admissions by GPs. So every weekend we might have admitted 10 or 11 patients to the Down Hospital at weekends. The GPs are now admitting directly into the wards 6 patients on average every weekend. And the other patients who are having to go to the Ulster Hospital are very quickly returning to the Down Hospital. Our staff are regularly engaging with the patients, their families, in terms of receiving feedback. We have been regularly engaging with interested community groups, political groups in the Downpatrick area. We're working jointly to improve the information we're sharing with our staff. We produced a leaflet that we sent to 40,000 homes in the Downpatrick area, to every GP surgery, pharmacy, a whole range of public areas. And we produced that leaflet in conjunction with our colleagues in Down District Council and the Down Community Hospital support group. So we are engaging on a regular basis, understanding what the implications of the changes we have made, taking actions to mitigate that and improve access to our services. But we're also very clear, where safety is compromised, we cannot wait for problems to happen. We must be proactive, take action, and ensure that we continue to respect, fulfill and protect the human rights of all of the people that we serve.
Okay, thank you. I know the clinician might want to comment, but I'm very conscious of time, so I'll ask Martyn to ask questions and then turn to Paul, and we'll maybe round up at the end on those issues. So, Martyn.
Good afternoon. I have 2 questions really on responsiveness, and the first one on responsiveness would be in terms of particular groups of patients who go to emergency departments, such as children, those with mental health needs, those with pre-existing brain injuries or elderly patients with dementia. What processes have you in place to identify how those people's needs are met? And what arrangements have you in place to provide better quality or higher standards of response to meet their particular needs?
You heard some of the specific examples from colleagues yesterday. So just to build on those, the first group you mentioned was around children, then around learning disability, mental health, and those with dementia. And the first point would be back to the importance of the holistic assessment, because in order to then avail of any of the services that are in place for particular groups, that holistic assessment is so important, because that's what identifies the need in the first place. So the first professional that any patient who comes to the ED department encounters is the triage nurse, and it's for that triage nurse in that process to identify not just that the patient is there with their sore leg, but that they also have other needs, and not just the patient themselves, but also if they have carers with them, what those needs are. In relation to specific groups, be it children, be it mental health patients, be it learning disability patients, I think a point to pick up on that perhaps didn't come across yesterday, we're, like every trust, a large organisation that has a lot of specialist expertise across the organisation which can be drawn on. So for example, with children, we have child protection nurses, we have an infrastructure there within the organisation which we then use as a resource to support those generalist staff, and be that at induction and within an introduction into the organisation, be that in ongoing training and development, and then built into appraisal. So for example, those staff within ED who would be caring for children can avail of specific child protection supervision from child protection nurse specialists, and that kind of approach would also apply to learning disability. So we have learning disability expertise within the trust, and that would be drawn on by our ED staff. They will have provided specific training for staff. We have the passport system, which you heard mentioned, made of yesterday, and again ongoing developments in pulling in that expertise to support the generalist frontline staff. Same would apply for mental health, and same would apply for those with dementia. We are fortunate within the trust we have a nurse consultant for dementia services, and again it would be through her auspices that the Butterfly Scheme would have been launched across the organisation, and specific training and support provided for ED staff.
I'm just interested in following up one aspect of that. Because the Ulster Emergency Department deals with children, there's no specialist children's ED, and emergency departments can be very busy. They can have quite a lot of sometimes difficult patients there. And Hugh's already outlined for oncology patients how you have arranged fast tracking to the wards. And I'm wondering, is there any similar provision in relation to children?
I would maybe take that, because I still presently work as an emergency clinician in that unit. We've always given children a higher priority probably than adults within reason, and children come at different times of the day. They'll often come in the evening whenever dad comes home from work and so on and so forth, and brings them in. So we would have a dedicated stream where possible, and that's virtually at all times, try and get those through quicker, where possible. During the day, we have a Monday to Friday service, 9 to 5, where there's a rapid response team in the one of the paediatric wards where GPs can access that directly and patients can access it directly. We will be looking at trying to provide that service, probably arising from your inquiry and our thoughts and views on it. And there are constraints, and there are financial constraints out there in the whole piece, but I think it's something that will be very valuable if we could have maybe some sort of open access later in the evening and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, late at night kids go to bed. So emergency department paediatric units, a standalone paediatric unit will not be busy after 11 o'clock at night, because they're all in bed, unless they're very sick. Yeah, but the numbers would be small. But there is that peak around tea time. So yes, we do have a stream basis where we identify maybe a doctor or a nurse, or depending, to see those patients quicker where possible, because they come with relatives and a whole variety of things, so that it makes the place appear more crowded than what it actually is.
Okay. The only other question I have is on diverts from your A&E, and I'm wondering what criteria does the Trust have to inform requests for diverts, and what would the proportion of requests be granted?
Just in terms of actual facts, in the past 13 months, there have been 11 diverts from the Ulster Hospital to the Royal Victoria Hospital. Interestingly, in the same time period, there were 7 diverts from the Royal to the Ulster. So, and I think there is a place for diverts within our wider health and social care system, because on any particular day, a hospital could be under significantly more pressure than other hospitals within the area. And obviously, we should all be working together to deliver the very best outcomes for all of our patients right across the region. So in terms of the process we go through, we have an escalation procedure in respect of each of our hospitals. There are triggers within those escalation processes, which will be based around, for example, the number of patients in the emergency department at a given time, the number of decisions to admit into a hospital bed, our bed availability on the day in question, other delays that there may be within our system, perhaps complex social patients who are still in the hospital, no longer needing acute care, maybe patients who require access to some diagnostics within the hospital. So a range of indicators, and very much in terms of the experience and expertise that our hospital and community staff have. Those escalation procedures will go from the emergency department, where we have 3 safety and patient flow huddles every day. We have twice daily meetings of our clinical managerial staff, including community and social work colleagues, to look at how the day is, what's the predictions for later on, to what extent will we be able to cope well within the capacity that we have developed and generated. So there are triggers. There's a formal escalation procedure that may then be escalated up to myself as a director, or ultimately potentially the chief executive as well. We do not make requests for diverts very often, and as I say, in the past 13 months, we've had 11 diverts from the Ulster to the Royal. We do use diverts a little bit more between the Down and Lagan Valley hospitals, because both of the hospitals will have fewer beds. A surge in activity can be disproportionately felt in, for example, the Down Hospital, which has 49 beds, or Lagan Valley, where we have 89 beds. So those hospitals work extremely well together. The ambulance service are fully involved in all of the discussions and decision making, but basically we have formal procedures to support that decision making.
Yeah. And are diverts only to the RVH and Down and Lagan Valley? There wouldn't be to Antrim or to Craigavon?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Okay.
The emergency department, I suppose, to be functional, has to be able to receive acutely ill patients at all times. If you get so full or whatever, that'll be an absolute thing that's where you would definitively need a divert if you couldn't have the ability to receive. So they'll always have to have a resus bay or something of those orders free, and clinical staff would work very closely, and they'll mitigate, and they'll move heaven and earth long before that ever happens internally, and so on and so forth. So when we ask for a divert, I think it's important that we get, even for a short period of time, it allows people a bit of breathing space and so on and so forth. I've always felt that, when I was growing up as a young SHO a long time ago, and sometimes you'd get numerous ambulances coming to an emergency department, and with the potential to maybe paralyse that emergency department. I'm not talking about any specific one, I'm just talking in general. And that, I felt, could never be a good thing, because you just need to even out that surge to give everybody a chance to do the job.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pass you now over to Paul.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the remarks from the panel. I completely recognise that emergency care is very complex indeed, and I'm very conscious of the wonderful work that's being done by many highly dedicated health professionals. I was interested in all the remarks made. Very interesting, and some of it signals some pioneering work, I think. And of course, it's work in progress, and it's noted. And I look forward to reading and learning more about it in the next days. My first question is, what, in your experience, are the main obstacles to deepening what might be called a human rights-based approach in your trust? What are the main obstacles to further deepening a human rights-based approach in your trust? And you did actually allude to a couple of them. Is it that the human rights-based approach is seen as a bit patronising, or it's a bit legalistic, or it's a bit vague? I'd be given the endeavours you're in good faith making in this regard. I'd be really genuinely interested to know what you see as the main obstacles to this important endeavour.
Not an easy question to answer, but I think you've touched on them a lot. I don't necessarily see those as obstacles. When I said earlier, I don't have a problem with a written framework. I don't think that's unhelpful at all. I think what I was maybe saying earlier was if you almost make that the raison d'etre for doing it, I think that is at odds with the sort of professional training, the values. You must do this because it's a human right. Actually, the vast majority of our staff see it because it's good quality of care. It's the values they want to live. It's the values they want to deliver. So actually, almost, I would see potentially mandating it and making it, this is obligatory because it's a human right, could get that little reaction you've mentioned. I think some of the other things are well documented. You've touched on them. Around a performance system which judges success by a small number of indicators which are clock-based, and at the minute do not have quality of care at the core. And for me, quality of care, as for many of our frontline staff, embraces and incorporates the key elements of human rights. So we deliver care in the right way: good communication, privacy, dignity, respect. Those things are right to the core of it, and those are the things we're building into our performance system. And across Northern Ireland, you can see them being tested in a number of ways. But actually, if we don't mainstream that into the way we judge success as a health and social care system, then we run the potential of creating that very much that mid-staff scenario where, yes, people will say that those are good things to measure, those are quality of care issues, but the organisation is judged against a different set of parameters, and that's what happened in mid-staff. It was money. As a foundation trust, it was money and targets. And so actually at a senior level, you created that became the priority. And the vast bulk of the performance system across the NHS still has those ingredients. It doesn't have quality of care as defined by human rights or as defined by our staff, which I believe are the same, at the core of how we judge success. And that to me is one of the greatest barriers, is when, and including the media, whenever they're looking at, we feed the media with, I suppose these are the indicators around how we judge success. So our ED system is being judged by 4 and 12 hour, not how well are we doing in Northern Ireland. And that I mentioned on the regional collaborative earlier. That was where we actually looked at how we were doing against, across quite a number of the hospitals, EDs, how well we were doing against the College of Emergency Medicine Standards. And we took Northern Ireland from being below the UK average in a 12-month period in dealing with sepsis, dealing with stroke, left before being seen, senior decision making, a whole range of indicators. We were well above the national average. Those things aren't part of our performance system. But for me, we have to mainstream those and start judging success by quality of care.
Thank you. I mean, I think there are obstacles, and they're not all of your making. I mean, I think one obstacle, speaking frankly, is that there isn't yet sufficient guidance on the detailed, practical operationalization of a human rights-based approach in various domains. And we do need that detailed, practical operationalization, and it has to be a collaborative exercise between health professionals and others. But nonetheless, still, progress can be made. Progress can be made in the meantime. Another question, please. Hugh, you referred to the NHS being top-down, in some quarters at least. And as you know, a human rights-based approach puts a premium on bottom-up participation of health professionals, patients, families, and the public. And as you've heard me say on previous days, it's not easy to engender this sort of bottom-up participation. In fact, it's very hard, and we mustn't look at participation in a sort of romantic way. And I'm wrestling with this idea of participation, and my mind remains open, and I'd really welcome your views on this. So let's just assume for the moment that you wish to deepen public participation in the governance of your trust. It's a big assumption, but let's just assume that you wish to deepen public participation in the governance of your trust. How might that be done? Realistically, how might that be done?
And you're talking public rather than staff?
Yes.
Because I think
yes. I mean, I'd be interested. I'm just worried about time. And I've noted some of your remarks about staff participation, and they are noted. The fact I'm not pursuing them is just a function of lack of time, but they are noted. And I suppose one other bit of this participation puzzle is public participation, and that isn't easy to organise. But I wondered, from your respective seats, whether you had any thoughts about how this public participation might be deepened in the governance of the trust.
I believe, I'd kick off and then others can maybe sort of throw in things that I've probably missed, but I don't think there's a single sort of, there's something you take off the shelf which is a magic bullet for this that suddenly, you apply that to the organisation, it works. It's one of those things, it's a bit like communication, it's one of those things you just got to keep doing. And the more that you do it, the more that you return you get from it. I think in terms of some of the things that we do, we have a PPI strategy, which is very much around the public and personal involvement. And we have a whole range of things that we're doing. When we look at, and Seamus talked earlier about our corporate plan, one of the 6 themes that we have, so one of the 6 priorities for the organisation is PPI and stakeholder engagement. So we're very clear that doing that is one of the 6 key priorities, one of the 6 themes for our organisation. We also deal with, so at a whole range of different levels, at a corporate level, we're doing a range of things for public involvement. We hold public meetings, we hold meetings with our councils. We have, at a service level, we have different user groups who are involved in individual services. Much talked about over the last few days, things like the 10,000 voices, feedback surveys, all those sorts of things. We also have and have been bringing to our trust board and encouraging also in other forums within the organisation to have patient stories. So we're actually bringing individual stories and using those stories. And similarly with the 10,000 voices, again, where individual stories are being used to influence what we do. I've given you some examples of that in terms of complaints. But within our own internal accountability system within the trust, we have regular performance meetings. I have a sort of biannual meeting with each of the directorates. And on the other quarters, so it's once a quarter, we have governance meetings. And one of the things we look at there is, well, what's the learning from complaints, from near misses, from SAIs? How do we use feedback from users? What are we doing in terms of PPI? So it's actually a part of each directorate's management plan that they have things that they are doing in terms of PPI involvement. They set that out at the start of the year, and we test whether we've actually delivered that and whether that is what the implications on learning of that have been. So we see this as a central part of our internal performance system.
Maybe just to add, I think we're quite fortunate in Northern Ireland. We have a very extensive community voluntary sector and a very large number of groups from small to large in terms of number who represent the public voice. So there are real opportunities there. And you said it's a big assumption. Let's assume we would want to further deepen. I think that's absolutely the direction of travel that the organisation wants to go in, and back to the progressive realisation, we're on that journey. There's still a way to go. And interestingly, one of the 13 questions within 10,000 Voices is specifically around how individuals felt they were engaged and involved in their care. And within our responses back to the 10,000 Voices piece, the majority of those who responded felt that absolutely was the case. So I think we're on the journey, and it's also about learning from what we're doing that's working well and further building on that.
And maybe just to add, from an operational perspective, I've lost count of the number of actual service user groups we have. I could give you examples of several. Some of the ones that spring to mind for me, for example, renal services. Our renal patients come to our dialysis service 3 times a week. They spend 4+ hours with us. It's a big part of their life. We absolutely want them to influence and shape how we deliver services to them. And one of the big issues for a number of our renal patients is their transport. If I'm picked up first thing in the morning, I don't want to be left off last thing during the day. So they're shaping the way we deliver our services across emergency care, cancer services, maternity services, a whole range of. But I think there's a way of improving that, and we can deepen user involvement in and influence how we deliver services. My director colleague Nicki and Mr. Malloy sitting in the audience, we undertake environmental cleanliness visits to every one of our wards. We have a user who walks the ward with us. They're part of the audit. They're part of shaping and influencing practice at a very basic level. And that is very much about protecting life, protecting health, and fulfilling the human rights of every single patient who comes into our wards.
I would say, we ask patients where possible and relatives with leaflets and so on and so forth, but complaints are a rich source of information for us to feedback whether we've got it right or got it wrong, or whether we need to make change, and we do reflect that back out to the wider organisation. So it does shape and change policy through our lessons learned committee and various other means that if we need to change or do something differently.
Thank you. I'm getting signals that I have to come to an end, but I'd like to ask this question, if I may, and it's a big question, and regrettably we don't have the time for a big answer, but any indications of an answer would be helpful. It's about the commissioning process with the board. And I wondered if you could, as briefly as possible, just send some telegraphic messages about who is involved in that process from your side, as it were. And in particular, if you are able to just comment briefly on the board's accountability reviews that are an important part of the process, as I understand. And one reason why I ask those two questions is because listening to you, I just wonder if there might not always be a neat fit between the approach that you've signalled and the board's approach. And I'm interested to know how any differences might manifest themselves in this critically important commissioning process.
I'll give my answer to the last bit, and then I'll let Seamus maybe expand. The answer is do those pull together. Your analysis, yes, that is correct. They don't align terribly well at the minute. And I think, I've set out why I've said, I don't think it's unique here. I think in terms of the NHS, we don't mainstream in the quality of care issues. And there's a great risk that we're judging success on a small number of parameters which are top-down, clock-based and seen as a priority. And those do not really judge, for me, quality of care in the right way. We've got to build a performance system which has those things at the core of how we judge success. And I don't think it can be a top-down. I think it has to be about building a system where you get assurance that that is being monitored at every team and every service level. And at the minute, but yes, your observation is correct, they do not align well.
In terms of how we engage with our commissioners, how our clinical staff, very importantly, engage with our commissioners, we absolutely involve our clinicians in all of the service development issues that we address with our commissioners. If we're discussing our performance around hip fracture, the 48-hour target for access to theatre, for example, our orthopaedic surgeons are part of the team that we have when we're in discussions with the commissioner. That's the same. You'll have heard that from Sean McGoran yesterday, our clinical director for emergency care. He is involved actively with us in our discussions with the commissioner. I would echo Hugh's sentiments. We are not aligned. I see evidence that we will become more aligned. I fear that it will take some time, and I think there needs to be a greater focus on commissioning. And if you get the commissioning right, there's a better chance of getting the performance right.
Did I just also clarify one thing? The biannual accountabilities we have are run by the department rather than the board. We do have sort of performance meetings where we look at some of the performance targets and progress with those, but our accountability meeting is actually with the department, and of which the board are present.
Oh, I see.
I would say at the accountability meeting there's a significant amount of quality indicators discussed, and a lot of the report of the accountability is around the quality of service that we provide, as well as the length of speed of data that Hugh has made reference to.
I'm not in, I know I have to stop, but I'm not in favour of a very legalistic, human rights-based approach to health. It's not, if you've read some of my stuff, you know, that's not my approach at all. So the following question might sound, given that, might sound a bit strange, but I'm interested to know. I mean, these discussions between board and trust, I mean, they're really important, and there's some misalignment, and even if there were perfect alignment, there are different interests.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also there are different interests, I would imagine, sometimes between trusts. So I'm just trying to understand how this works. So you, from time to time, will need legal advice on these difficult issues, I would imagine. I mean, there are millions of pounds at stake.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious as to whom do you turn if you need legal advice?
We have our own legal service for the HSC in Northern Ireland, which is provided through the Business Services Organisation, and it's the Directorate of Legal Services within that.
Right.
Now, that is, if we're getting to the point where we actually have to take legal advice on the relationship issues, it's pretty rare, and we've reached the end of the line, I think, when we get to that point. What we would tend to do is debate those things in the forums that we have. We would also tend to raise them and escalate them to the department in terms at accountability, in terms of things if we can't get resolved. And I suppose that's all part of the sort of daily thrust of relationships, because I suspect it's no different in any region. The commissioner and the main providers, there will be tensions. Yeah. And while I was quite negative, I think the process that's been set up by the region around looking at unscheduled care, this is the one chaired by the CMO and CNO, have appear to have accepted that actually there needs to be a broader range of indicators than 4-hour and 12-hour, and want to see that there will be other quality indicators built into that system, which we would encourage.
But just so I understand, and I know it's a sort of tedious lawyer's question, but of course there's going to be this give and take, you know, trading, give and take, you know, that's the way of the world, and administration and governance. I understand that. But the lawyers that you might have to look to occasionally for advice, it sounds to me as though they're the same department of lawyers that advises the department, and it's the same. Is it no? Is it
the department would have different
so
legal advisors?
The board,
yeah.
The same group of lawyers that advises the board as advises you and advises the other trusts.
Yes.
Okay. I could go on, but I mustn't. Thank you so much.
The one question you didn't ask us was what were the two things we would most like to see happen. We feel deprived.
We want to give an answer.
Well, I'm sorry, but you could have, we've got way over time. Get 30 seconds each, starting with Charlie. Two things that you'd like to see done differently.
I suppose
Sound bites, please.
I welcome the focus on emergency medicine. It's particularly dear to me. I do want to see, I suppose, the commissioning got right, and I want to see quality at the focus of what we do.
The political will in the region to make some of the difficult decisions that are absolutely required for sustainability of the service moving forward, and to ensure that we can continue to protect human rights. And secondly, holistic, person-centred care is core to what I am as a nurse. That holistic approach, be it to performance management, be it to how we align from department to board to provider, absolutely key.
It touched on a new performance system or a way of judging, it sounds very a performance system, a way of judging success that has quality of care at the core of how we judge it. And I believe integral to that is human rights. And I suppose I have to say, on the day when our First Minister made the announcement that he made this morning, I think one of the things we struggle with is, and I will illustrate with, is we have at an executive meeting a budget which is agreed, which requires us to save £17 million, and yet the parties round that table will castigate us for any pound, any post, any bed that we take out of a service in a particular area. And that creates great difficulties for us in terms, as public sector leaders. Find 17 million, but don't do it in my patch. And we need a political system that will give us the leadership to make the changes we need to make and to create that new system.
And for me, so much of what we deal with is about demand and capacity. At the Ulster Hospital in the past 3 years, we've had to deal with a 35% increase in emergency admissions. And that's against the 9% increase in beds. Those things do not reconcile very well. And I have to take my hat off to our staff, who have been remarkable in dealing with that extraordinary level. To put it in context, it's 6,000 extra patients in beds. It's about the equivalent of 100 beds, and we got 40 extra. So there's so much more that we need to do across the 7 days. That would be my big plea. We need to enhance our services across truly 7-day services so that we actually can put more patients through the very limited beds that we do have. I'm sure we can make progress, but we need more infrastructure to support that, and that will require investment. I have no doubt about that. The second thing that I would make a plea for is people really need to be open to new ways of working and new ways of delivering urgent care. I think, again, it is quite remarkable that 3 years ago, when we had a 24/7 ED in the Down Hospital, we had just under 41,000 people used the ED and the GP out of hours. Today, when we have reduced ED opening hours, we have a nurse-led minor injury service, and we still have our GP out of hours. We have 42,500 people who are going through the front doors of the Down Hospital. We can and must reshape services. People need to be open to those new ways of working.
Okay, I'd like to thank Hugh, you and all your colleagues. I'll end by giving you a very quick bit of feedback, because I think you and your colleagues had left yesterday. One very interesting witness we had yesterday, who was very, very happy with the service he had received from the Ulster, and went to give feedback to, tried to give feedback to the Trust online, and couldn't find a way of doing it other than positive feedback, couldn't do it other than to go onto the complaint system, score out this is not a complaint, and then give you good feedback. So it may well be you have those mechanisms for positive comments, but you might want to reflect on that piece of feedback. So thank you for your time.